Good evening. My name is Joseph Sipitz for the St. Joseph County Public Library, and it is time for another adult story time. Tonight I'll be reading from the Sherlock Holmes adventure, The Hound of the Baskervilles, and I will be reading from Chapter 2, whereupon the curse of the Baskervilles is described. The characters in this chapter are, of course, Sherlock Holmes and his trusty Watson, but also Dr. James Mortimer, who was a country doctor and confidant of the Baskerville family, who has brought this problem to Sherlock Holmes to figure out. And he is about to read a manuscript written in 1742 that describes the Baskerville curse. Holmes leaned back in his chair, placed his fingertips together, and closed his eyes with the air of resignation. Dr. Mortimer turned the manuscript to the light and read in a high, crackling voice the following curious old-world narrative. Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles, there have been many statements, yet as I come in a direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and as I have had the story from my father, who also had it from his, I have set it down with the belief that it occurred even as is here set forth. And I would have you believe, my sons, that the same justice that punishes sin may also most graciously forgive it, and that no ban is so heavy but that by prayer and repentance it may be removed. Learn then from this story not to fear the fruits of the past, but rather to be circumspect in the future, that those foul passions whereby our family has suffered so grievously may not again be loosened to our undoing. Know then that in the time of the Great Rebellion, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name, nor can it be gainsaid that he was a most wild, profane, and godless man. This, in truth, his neighbors might have pardoned, seeing that saints have never flourished in these parts, but there was in him a certain wanton and cruel humor which made his name a byword through the West. It chanced that this Hugo came to love the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate, but the young maiden, being discreet and of good repute, would ever avoid him, for she feared his evil name. So it came to pass that one Michaelmas, this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, stole down upon the farm and carried off the maiden, her father and brothers being from home, as he well knew. When they had brought her to the hall, the maiden was placed in an upper chamber, while Hugo and his friends sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Now, the poor lass upstairs was like to have her wits turned at the singing and shouting and terrible oaths which came up to her from below. For they say that the words used by Hugo Baskerville when he was in wine were such that might blast the man who heard them. At last, in the stress of her fear, she did which she might have daunted the bravest and most active man, for by the aid of the growth of ivy which covered and still covers the south wall, she came down from the eaves, and so homeward across the moor, there being 3 leagues betwixt the hall and her father's farm. It chanced that some little time later Hugo left his guests to carry food and drink, and other worse things perchance, to his captive, and so found the cage empty and the bird escaped. Then, as it would seem, he became as one that hath a devil, for, rushing down the stairs into the dining hall, he sprang upon the great table, flagons and trenchers flying before him, and he cried aloud before all the company that he would that very night render his body and soul to the powers of evil, if he might but overtake the wench. And while the revellers stood aghast at this fury of the man, one more wicked, or it may be more drunken than the rest, cried out that they should put the hounds upon her, whereupon Hugo ran from the house, crying to his grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack, and giving the hounds the kerchief of the maids, he swung them to the line, and so off on full cry in the moonlight over the moor. Now, for some space the revellers stood agape, unable to understand all that had been done in such haste, but anon their bemused wits awoke to the nature of the deed which was like to be done upon the moorlands. Everything was now in an uproar, some calling for the pistols, some calling for their horses, and some for another flask of wine. But at length some sense came back to the crazed minds, and the whole of them, 13 in number, took horse and started in pursuit. The moon shone clear above them, and they rode swiftly abreast, taking that course which the maid must needs have taken if she were to reach her own home. They had gone on a mile or two when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands, and they cried to him to know if he had seen the hunt. And the man, as the story goes, was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak, but at last he said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds upon her track. But I have seen more than that, said he, for Hugo Baskerville passed me on a black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels. So the drunken squires cursed the shepherd and rode onwards, but soon their skins turned cold, for there came the sound of a galloping across the moor, and the black mare, dabbled with white froth, went past with trailing bridle and empty saddle. Then the revellers rode close together, for a great fear was on them, but they still followed over the moor, though each, had he been alone, would have been right glad to have turned his horse's head. Riding slowly in this fashion, they came at last upon the hounds. These were, though known for their valor and their breed, were whimpering in a cluster at the head of a deep dip, or goyle as we call it, upon the moor, some slinking away, while some, with startling hackles and staring eyes, gazing down the narrow valley before them. The company had come to a halt, more sober men, as you may guess, than when they had started. The most of them would by no means advance, but 3 of them, the boldest, or it may be the most drunken, rode forward down the goyle. Now it opened into a broad space in which stood 2 of the great stones still to be seen there, which had been set by certain forgotten peoples in the day of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the center lay the unhappy maid where she had fallen, dead of fear and of fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor was it that of the body of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised the hair upon their heads of these 3 daredevil roysters, but it was that standing over Hugo and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that had mortal eye ever rested on. And even as they looked, the thing tore out the throat of Hugo Baskerville, on which it had turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, and the 3 shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming up across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night from what he had seen. The other twain, were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down, it is because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which is but hinted at and guessed. Nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious, yet may we shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not forever punish the innocent beyond the 3rd or 4th generation, which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and counsel you, by way of caution, to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. Okay. There's a short description of Sir Charles Baskerville. I'm going to skip that over and then turn to we find out that he was a good man and that he had donated to people, so hooray for him. But Dr. Mortimer refolded his paper and replaced it in his pocket. Hooray for good press. Those are the public facts, Mr. Holmes, in connection with the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. I must thank you, said Sherlock Holmes, for calling my attention to this case, which certainly presents some features of interest. I had observed some newspaper comment at the time, but I was exceedingly preoccupied by that little affair of the Vatican cameos, and in my anxiety to oblige the Pope, I lost touch with several interesting English cases. This article, you say, contains all the public facts? It does. Then let me have the private ones. He leaned back, put his fingertips together, and assumed his most impassive and judicial expression. In doing so, said Dr. Mortimer, who had begun to show signs of strong emotion, I am telling that which I have not confided to anyone. My motive for withholding it from the coroner's inquiry is that a man of science shrinks from placing himself in the public position of seeming to endorse a public superstition. I had the further motive that Baskerville Hall, as the paper says, would certainly remain untenanted if anything were done to increase its already rather grim reputation. For both these reasons, I thought that I was justified in telling rather less than I knew, since no practical good could result from it. But here with you, there is no reason why I should not be perfectly frank. The moor is very sparsely inhabited, and those who live near each other are thrown very much together. For this reason, I saw a great deal of Sir Charles Baskerville, with the exception of Mr. Frankland of Laughlin Hall and Mr. Stapleton, a naturalist. There are no other men of education within many miles. Sir Charles was a retiring man, but the chance of his illness brought us together, and a community of interest in science kept us so. He had brought back much scientific information from South Africa, and many a charming evening we had spent together discussing the comparative anatomy of the Bushman and the Hottentot. Within the last few months, it became increasingly plain to me that Sir Charles's nervous system was strained to the breaking point. He had taken this legend, which I have read you, exceedingly to heart, so much that, although he would walk on his own grounds, nothing would induce him to go out upon the moor at night. Incredible as it may appear to you, Mr. Holmes, he was honestly convinced that the dreadful fate overhung his family, and certainly the records which he was able to give of his ancestors were not encouraging. The idea of some ghastly presence constantly haunted him, and on more than one occasion he had asked me whether I had on my medical journeys at night ever seen any strange creature or heard of any baying of a hound. The latter question he put to me several times, but always with a voice which vibrated with excitement. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore, the butler, who had made the discovery, sent Perkins, the groom, on horseback to me, and I was sitting up late and was able to reach Baskerville Hall within the hour of the event. I checked and corroborated all the facts which were mentioned in the inquest. I followed the footsteps down the yew alley. I saw the spot in the moor where he had seemed to have waited. I remarked the change of the shape of the prints after that point. I noted that there were no other footprints save of Barrymore on the soft gravel, and finally I carefully examined the body, which had not been touched since my arrival. Sir Charles lay on his face, his arms out, his fingers dug into the ground, and his features convulsed with some strong emotion, to which such an extent that I could not have hardly sworn to his identity. There was certainly no physical injury on of his kind. But one false statement was made by Barrymore at the inquest. He said that there were no traces upon the ground around the body. He did not observe any, but I did, some little distance off, but fresh and clear. Footprints? Footprints. A man or a woman's? Dr. Mortimer looked strangely at us for an instant, and his voice sank almost to a whisper as he answered, Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound. End of chapter. Good evening, and we'll come again with another story next week.